Weyerhaeuser performed on their business resilience activities. The format for today is I'll give a quick introduction and recap of some of the points from our report. Then that will probably take about 5 minutes. Then Sara will spend about a half an hour going through some of the activities that Weyerhaeuser has been involved in to boost their resilience. And at the end, we'll do some Q&A, and I request that folks use the questions box associated with the GoToMeeting, and we'll be able to repeat the questions verbally over the line because everybody will be muted. So once we get this going here, let's see. All right. So from our report, I think one of the motivations for the report and a lot of the motivations for the companies involved in pursuing resilience is a recognition that extreme weather is costly. During 2012, over 800 weather-related disasters across the globe led to over $130 billion in losses. And this includes Hurricane Sandy and the Midwest drought, each of which were tens of billions of dollars in damage. In addition to those events, wildfires across a lot of the Southwest during both 2012 and 2011 had some pretty significant losses. And losses in Thailand from a particularly damaging flood led to significant losses and a lot of disruption of the global supply of hard drives associated with factories. And these are some of the events that I think have raised attention for this issue. Within the report, we found that a lot of companies really are perceiving this risk and see impacts happening sometime, if not already, within the next 10 years. However, not that many companies, only a small percentage of companies, are actually building in considerations of future climate into their business continuity plans. And we've found this out and kind of through 3 sets of analyses. First, in looking at the S&P Global 100 and some of the disclosures associated with companies in the Carbon Disclosure Project, SEC 10Ks, and the sustainability reports. We also performed case studies with 6 companies, including Weyerhaeuser, and we had a workshop with many corporate representatives and government agencies in last November. From this analysis, we found that one of the barriers in companies taking action it has often been dealing with the uncertainty associated with climate data and the lack of decision-relevant tools to translate data into actual decisions. We developed several recommendations, including expanding public-private partnerships to help address resilience and trying to identify and remove regulatory barriers that act as a disincentive for companies pursuing resilience. One of the other parts of the report that I think is valuable to know about and something that the Weyerhaeuser case study really illustrates well is its 4 steps for managing climate risk. First, to build internal awareness within a corporation. Second, to assess vulnerabilities. Third, to actually make decisions that reduce risk or identify opportunities. And fourth, to reassess and review and evaluate. And within the case study, we really encourage you to check out the report. I think Weyerhaeuser has a really sophisticated approach to all of these steps. So that's kind of the highlights. And now to have Sara share her slides. Sara Kendall is the Vice President for Corporate Affairs and Sustainability at Weyerhaeuser Company, a $7 billion per year forest products company. She is responsible for the company's sustainability strategy, EHS programs, federal and state government affairs, corporate communications, and corporate philanthropy. In addition to her work for Weyerhaeuser, Ms. Kendall worked as Natural Resource Legislative Counsel for Washington Senators Daniel J. Evans and Slade Gordon. She received a JD from the Georgetown University Law Center, a Master of Forest Science from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and a BA in Political Science from Northwestern University. She has served on the Board of Directors for the Environmental Law Institute and as a member of EPA's National Advisory Council for Environmental Policy and Technology. So with that, Sarah, please take it away.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Joe, for that kind introduction, and good morning and good afternoon to those of you listening on the phone. I appreciate having the chance to present our case story. I do think we have taken some interesting approaches, some of it very obviously related to the work that we do. So let me start off with who are we. Weyerhaeuser Company is an integrated forest products company over 100 years old and headquartered in Washington State. We have operations that span North and South America, though we're more concentrated in North America. Many of our products do have a global reach from both logs to pulp. And the majority of our four businesses are focused on home building, so that's the growing and harvesting of trees, manufacturing of wood products, and building homes as well as residential developments. But we also produce cellulose fiber products, or pulp, which are used in personal care products such as diapers, as well as newspapers, printing papers, and that hard board that you will find in liquid packaging, such as milk containers. And we have, so in terms of size, we were about $7 billion in sales in 2012 and have about 13,000 employees. Joe, if you could go to the next slide. This is a summary slide about who we are, that we really see that I'll make sure we're getting to the next slide. Yeah, thanks. Sorry. The trees are really, what we do is grow trees. We make sustainable products, and we believe our sustainability value proposition is to make useful products that society needs. And it starts with that our large timberlands asset, and that's how we think about that value proposition through all of our product lines. If I could have the next slide. So I've talked a lot about timberlands. We are one of the world's largest private forest land owners. That's nearly 21 million acres of land. About 7 million acres are acres we own in the United States, and then about 14 million are acres that we manage on long-term licenses in Canada. We also have timberland holdings in Uruguay. And as you can see from the other slide, we have managed this forest for this combination of forests starting about 100 years ago on a sustainable basis. So we really are harvesting just a small % of that timberlands base every year. And the next slide. And this is just, we have all of the lands, whether we own those lands or manage those lands, we have certified to sustainable forestry standards in all the countries in which we operate. So that was just some background that I wanted to talk about Weyerhaeuser. If we can now go to the next slide, I'm going to start focusing in on our resilience issues, and I'm going to talk about 3 focus areas for business resilience. I think the first one to focus on, based on the amount of timberland that we are responsible for, is really a focus on forest ecosystems, and in particular how we prepare and think about weather as it impacts our forest ecosystems. As weather events change and we experience extreme weather events, we have really focused even harder on what we need to do to ensure that we are protecting and managing that asset. So the first place to start preparing for weather events is looking at the work we do in our research. I'll talk a bit more about that, as well as silviculture. So silviculture is like agriculture, but it is what you do for managing trees in the forest instead of crops. And then risk assessment and mitigation. And when we think about, our largest asset, which is our timberlands, obviously our factory is the forest, so it's pretty simple. Our product grows in weather, and we care when weather patterns change. For us, we are growing. My emphasis on the fact that we are focused on home building means we are really growing trees to their maturity. So in many times, we're not seeing a product from our investment in seedlings for 25 to 40 years, depending on the geography in which we operate. So it's a very long timeline, and obviously a lot of risk in as the trees are out in nature and can be greatly affected by weather events. In the West, we've long taken an approach to assess operations on steep slopes, both to understand what the geology is, where our risks are based on that geology, and to try to adjust our silviculture approach and harvesting approaches to ensure that we are not operating in a way to generate landslides. We had a program that we felt very confident about until about 3 or 4 years ago, or 2008 actually. There was a extreme weather event, basically a 500-year storm event that did cause landslides. And curiously, it caused landslides in both areas that had been harvested as well as areas that were fully occupied with a mature forest. So it wasn't obvious that the silviculture practice, I guess it was clear that the silviculture practice wasn't the issue, and what we needed to do was really understand those risks better. So we undertook a more intense assessment and risk management approach so that we are prepared for another such event should it come along. Another very classic silvicultural practice, such as thinning a forest stand, is one that will have benefits both of producing more volume on the remaining trees, but it also really helps to mitigate damage from excessive wind. We operate primarily in the Pacific Northwest, and then, but broadly across the South, and hurricanes are an ever-present risk that we face every year. If our forest stands, if we can manage our forest stands in a way to help mitigate, some of the risks of wind damage, we have done enough analysis on that we can protect those forest stands under many conditions. Maybe not under the most extreme hurricane condition, but we have found ways to manage to be able to let the wind, not result in an excessive blowdown of a forest stand. That risk mitigation has to be done considering what do you want out of the density of your stand. Usually having it a little more open is going to be better from a wind standpoint, but you also need to understand soils, the predominant wind direction, the velocity, and other factors. We also use, I put on the slide listed genetic selection because this is actually has been a very important part of our risk mitigation strategies in particularly thinking about climate change. We have had a long-standing, for about 40 years, we have worked on how can we select the genes out of the pool of trees that we own to get the more superior tree from what we're looking for, which is obviously we want it to be straighter and grow faster and those characteristics. So through a few generations now of selecting those superior genes, and we then grow those seedlings in nurseries, and those are the seedlings that we plant after we harvest in an area. And it's had a very interesting, that initially our focus 30 or 40 years ago as we started this program was on just getting better trees. But as we've spent a lot of time on some of our research activities and understood issues like climate and ecosystems and genetic, we've actually have found that we have increased in a local area, like out here in the Northwest where the predominant tree species is Douglas fir. When we plant a genetically superior seedling that might come from Oregon and we plant it in a forest in Washington, while it's all the same large species, which is Douglas fir, there are differences that in the way those trees have evolved over time. And actually, so in a local area, in that Washington forest, we increased the genetic diversity from the forest that really just had inputs from the years of evolution of the trees that were originally grown in that area. That genetic diversity actually really helps those localized forest stands withstand particularly insect infestations and disease. Can I have the next slide? So one of our other kind of risk mitigation issues is to really focus on getting any stand where we've had a harvesting activity. We move in as quickly as possible. We like to do it within the same year, but certainly no longer than the second planting season after harvesting, to reestablish the site with a growing forest. That both helps prevent erosion and runoff, and again, that's important where if you have kind of an excessive flood type of event. We also want to accelerate what we call green up, meaning to reestablish forest cover very quickly. So generally, it depends on how many, what the exact acreage is. Last year in 2012, we actually planted 63 million seedlings, so it's a big job to get those acres reoccupied with a growing stand. Can I have the next slide, please? So importantly, we identify, or we understand that our forests provide more than timber, and so we have undertaken an effort to really track, measure, and report on 18 different ecosystem services, in addition to the fiber and the logs that we normally produce. This is also an importance from a resilience standpoint because the health of our ecosystems tells us a lot about the health of our factories, as I referred to it earlier. And obviously weather events are going to have a big impact on those larger ecosystems. It's important that they are resilient in order for those ecosystems to recover after such an event. So I just want to talk a little bit about ecosystem services. If I could have the next slide. And a lot of this detail, if people are interested, there's more detail that's certainly on the Weyerhaeuser.com website. We have a sustainability report, and you can go in and look at this in greater detail. But we've identified our ecosystem services, and we've organized them in accordance with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Approach, meaning that we've identified services that are in the provisioning category, meaning they produce products or goods that people use. They're in a regulating category, meaning that they are kind of inherent to the functioning of the whole ecosystem. They may be cultural services such as recreation, aesthetic, and spiritual benefits, or supporting services which are really sort of the fundamental photosynthesis, nutrient cycling, et cetera, that you need to support those other services. Can I have the next slide? This is just a brief overview. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just wanted to show what I mean, because sometimes those words might not be obvious to a lot of people what provisioning we're talking about, and This is, again, the category of products, so we include everything from the actual fiber, the round, what we would call round wood or the logs, in addition to things like honey boxes, livestock grazing, fur production, and other categories of actual products that come off of the timberlands. Okay, the next category, or next slide, sorry. So the next categories are kind of regulatory and cultural services, and this, I think, is really important in understanding how resilient our ecosystems are in order for us to also assess risks to our forest land assets. And if you look at issues like fire resistance, so out here in the West, we've experienced a lot of drought in recent years. Expectations are under a climate change scenario that may happen with greater frequency. So it's important for us to understand how well our timberland acres have done when threatened by fires on adjacent lands. We've actually, this is one where we feel our silvicultural practices really enhance our ability to withstand the threat of fire from in the face of drought. Okay, the next slide, please. And then these on supporting services represent a lot of ecosystem values, typically do not have any direct monetary benefits, but we see them as being very vital to the functioning of a forest ecosystem. So that is looking at things like habitat and soil productivity, and we do a lot of work and a lot of research in this area. So if we can go to the next slide, I wanted to speak a little bit about research because I think this is one of the areas that that we have really done, I think, a very good job in trying to assess one risk, but also understand what we need to do to adapt and improve our approaches. So while, as you can see from the chart there, much of our forest research dollars are targeted at productivity, largely in terms of genetics and silviculture, but we also spend a significant amount of research dollars focused on forest sustainability. So for example, in terms of what I mean by that, we look at what are the impacts from forest management on the water table from different silvicultural practices. What is, and that might include looking at stand density of our replanting efforts, or looking at thinning, pre-commercial thinning, commercial thinning, what stand density you have after thinning, looking at different rotation ages. We actually have some of the oldest data that anyone has, because we have what we call paired watersheds research that we've done in the West, in North Carolina, and down in Uruguay, extending over about a 30-year period, where we have an unmanaged stand and we do a watershed analysis compared with a managed stand, and we do a watershed analysis. So we can actually track changes in both in kind of how we're managing the forest and seeing whether or not that has any discernible impact. But we also over that period of time have collected, again, a lot of data. So we can understand, are we seeing trend lines in you know, where the water table is in a particular area, trend lines in rainfall, trend lines in growth. It really has been a terrific tool to have access to that much data to give us a sort of early warning or knowledge basis to figure out what we need to do to adapt and move forward. We also have research projects looking at our soils, particularly carbon in soils, carbon in the biota, both above ground and below ground. We have research into aquatic ecosystems, habitat, and wildlife. And again, all of this research provides both a lens into the productivity of the forest, and obviously we need to have those forests be productive from a revenue generating standpoint, but we also need to have them be productive and healthy from a forest ecosystem standpoint. So if we can go to the next slide. The second area that I wanted to talk about in terms of a resilience focus is really looking at our manufacturing side and to try to prepare ourselves for a lower carbon future by first taking accountability and reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions, but also utilizing more renewable energy. And for us, we do have the advantage of having access to a lot of biomass. So a lot of our efforts in terms of our fuel strategy is to replace fossil fuels that we used to use to a much greater extent, and then utilizing more biomass for combustion to fuel our energy needs at our manufacturing plants. So I'll come back to that point with a little bit more detail. If we can go on to the next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about the way we analyze and look at our greenhouse gas footprint. Again, we see pluses and minuses. On the plus side, our forests obviously actively sequester carbon, pulling carbon dioxide out of the air and storing it as carbon in the trees. And then as we manufacture, we mill those trees into long-lived wood products such as a 2x4 and a 2x4 that goes into building a house. We can measure, and using internationally accepted methodologies, we can track how much carbon is basically stored permanently in a very measurable way. On the negative side, or the emission side, we do have significant manufacturing operations. We have office buildings and transportation equipment that all emit carbon dioxide. And we will purchase some of our own electric power needs. In some cases, like in the West, we might be getting that power from more renewable sources such as hydro, but we also purchase a lot of power in the South, and that will tend to come from more non-renewable sources such as coal. If I could go to the next slide, we like to talk a lot about a carbon cycle, and because we see it as a net positive, mitigating from our company standpoint. As I talked about previously, where we grow trees that sequester carbon, that's one of our positives in terms of reducing the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide that we have. And then we keep our forests, because we manage them on a sustainable basis. They are really we think of the forest actually as a neutral, because we are growing and harvesting, so it is staying neutral over time. The carbon storage that comes from manufacturing wood products is really where we think there's a net benefit to the carbon balance, because we can permanently lock up that carbon for over 100 years. And then importantly, we've had this effort to really focus on manufacturing and displace or replace fossil fuel-based combustion that provide power and steam that we need for our manufacturing, and we are replacing that with biomass. So I think on the next slide is looking at what the company has committed to in terms of our greenhouse gas portfolio. In 2006, we made a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2020 on an absolute basis. Since that time, we have actually restructured our business a couple of times. We're currently at about a 28% reduction. But we continue to see ourselves making progress and believe we can still achieve this target in the years ahead of us. Our opportunities to reduce really come with our ability to make the investments to change out fossil fuel-based energy sources with energy sources that can use biomass. So can I have the next slide? And this is just looking at what the carbon portfolio looks like in both the positives and negatives. So you can see in 2012 we've reported 3.9 million metric tons of stored carbon in the long-lived wood products, as well as the emissions associated both with our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So if I could have the next slide. And then, so part of the business resilience is really looking at maybe taking more control of our energy future, because for all of the reasons, both climate change as well as security type issues, we have felt that this was a really smart strategy for us to continue to utilize more and more biomass to power our mills. We have access to a lot of biomass, and so it's a very synergistic approach for us meeting our power generation needs. It is, and we look again at while the biomass combustion does produce carbon dioxide emissions, we know that the growing forest that we have planted in behind the trees that we initially harvested that produced first the logs and then the chips that go into biomass will be, those forests will be basically reabsorbing the carbon dioxide. So from these slides you can see we've in 2012 reported that we're using about 76% of renewable energy from biomass. So it's a really high degree of energy self-sufficiency, which is both from a energy supply standpoint makes us kind of more resilient particularly as fossil fuel prices, we've experienced volatility in those. We feel we'll have biomass will be less volatile, and it's also a lower cost fuel source. So this has been a steady effort over the last decade. I think when we first started tracking this, we were a lot closer to about a 50% energy self-sufficiency. So that's been a really good gain over time. And then if I could have the next slide. So the last area that I wanted to talk about in terms of resilience is really in product innovation. And sometimes when I talk about our business and I say, well, we make 2x4s, and people might think, well, a 2x4 hasn't changed very much. But actually, we really do have some very interesting innovative products. And all of those are done with kind of helping us kind of project forward how to make us more resilient as a business and innovate in our products. But I think it's also a number of the products relate directly to impacts on society from issues associated with climate change. So we have a business called Weyerhaeuser Solutions. It's a relatively new business. That's looking at customers who are similarly very interested in ecosystem services, trying to manage for some of those, trying to look at natural capital, using that in a way that perhaps they didn't really think about previously. And so we have, that business is utilizing a lot of the knowledge base that we have developed over 100 years of silviculture to help people look at their own investments into natural resource management. We're also working with customers on alternative energy products such as cellulosic biofuels. We have a joint venture called Catchlight Energy with Chevron. We are also looking at wind and geothermal energy opportunities on our timberlands asset. I've got a product listed there called Arborite, and that's a slow-release nitrogen fertilizer that is both providing clean water benefits because the release of nitrogen is slower and therefore less likely to run off into watersheds, as well as obviously greenhouse gas benefits. Our real estate business, we've got subsidiaries across the country doing home building in different locations, but they've all adopted something called the Living Smart program to offer customers features to improve energy efficiency, conserve the resources, and they tend to focus those on the resource needs of the region where they are located. We have programs to improve air and water quality, indoor water quality in particular, and minimize water consumption. In our wood products business, we can introduce some innovative products that both expand our markets, improve profits, but also it helps our customers be more resilient, and that's the piece that I find very exciting. So one such product, you see the reference there to downpour technology, and that's it's a new product that helps homes that are exposed to adverse weather events during construction to be able, this is particularly water-related events, so this allows an exposed building to more quickly shed and eliminate the water to keep it from pooling on an exposed floor, as that home is being built, that both eliminates waste and in addition to eliminating delays in the construction. And again, a product that our customers really appreciate because that helps them be more resilient. Another product that we make combines insulation with weight-bearing products for home construction that will meet new federal Energy Star home building standards. Our cellulose fibers business is also looking for products that use more wood-based fiber or cellulose. We like to call it a green polymer. So in some products, we make reference to a product called Pearl. We can displace petroleum-based products with a cellulosic-based product, and customers are interested in that benefit in products that they then use and make. We have another product that we introduced last year called Thrive to increase the amount of renewable raw material in a composite product that can be used for household products as well as automobiles. So this is a product that we made in conjunction with Ford, who has a commitment to increase the amount of renewable materials that they're using in their automobiles. And this is a product, is a thermoplastic product basically that can be a molded product that can be used for things like interior consoles and dashboards. And we have figured out a way to make those products but incorporate more cellulose fibers into them. Can I have the next slide? So, and when I talk about product innovation, it is both what products we produce and take out to the marketplace, but it's also how we produce them. So we have worked very diligently to try to, one, make sure we are utilizing as much of the log as possible and losing as little bit to any kind of a waste need from again, log to what we refer to affectionately as hog fuel to fuel our power boilers. But we're also really trying to work on reducing waste that we send to landfills. So that obviously has greenhouse gas benefits in the less methane emissions from those landfills. And then if I could go to the last slide. So this is just a sum of what we believe we do, which is to make the most out of every tree and deliver sustainable solutions to meet the everyday needs of society for shelter, personal hygiene, energy, food, believe it or not, and clothing. And we do this with what I really like to call the world's first carbon capture and storage technology, the tree. So with that, Joe, I will I'll conclude my remarks here, and would certainly be happy if there are any questions that people have. Be happy to take them.
Great, thank you, Sarah. That was a great presentation. We have a few questions here that we've received or that we've concocted, but I encourage the participants listening in to go ahead and type in your questions and send them our way, and we'll read them here and present them for the group. So the first question is, you had talked quite a bit about some of the research efforts that Weyerhaeuser has and some pretty extensive monitoring in forests around the world. Obviously, there's a lot of cost involved in that, and it's hard to, it's something that's been invested in for a long time. Do you have any advice for a company that may be smaller and doesn't have perhaps the same level of resources, or that may be just embarking on some of this kind of monitoring and assessment that Weyerhaeuser's been doing for a while?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say there actually are the first thing I would do, which is actually what we have done, because we don't, those programs are costly. And I think the really smart answer is to work on a good partnership either with universities or independent organizations that are working on research in this area as well. We have, for example, our most recent timberland acquisition was in Uruguay, which started about 15 or so years ago, 15 to 20 years ago. And we recognized, based on some of the work that we had started here in the United States, that it would be very important for us to do that work. But we faced that same problem, that it was really costly to try to set up a whole research station down there. So we're in a consortium with probably 6 different universities We also work with an organization called the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement, which is a research group in the forest products industry. And each of those schools has a different topic or different focus that professors are looking at. And so what everyone has sort of pooled resources to set up the infrastructure for doing some of that research, and then they send down graduate students here or there to collect that research. We have a really try to have a really open access policy, particularly around research that has to do with understanding ecosystems and sustainability. Obviously, some of the research that where we're focused on our own productivity is more proprietary in nature, but the information on ecosystems, we want people to be able to share that and utilize that themselves. So if you're new and you're looking at this, I would really encourage it, because I think science is really important to understand facts. Sometimes things that might seem intuitive turn out to be different than you think when you actually get facts. But I think partnerships and consortiums are the way to go, and sort of pooled resources to be able to look at. It's really hard for any one entity to look at every aspect of an ecosystem. So that would be my, I guess, first area of recommendation.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And that actually answered what was going to be another question about, what types of partnerships can you form. So thanks for doing double duty. One question that came in is a clarification question, that in one of your previous slides you had shown what seemed to be 5 areas related to resilience, but in some of your comments you had said that there are 3 business resilience areas. I was wondering if you could just recap what's kind of the big 3 areas in resilience planning for Weyerhaeuser.
Yeah, and maybe the confusion is, so I lumped together all of the forest ecosystem areas of resilience, of which there were 5 specific areas, but I just called it all forest ecosystem resilience. So that's, so my big 3 areas were: 1, everything we're doing around forest ecosystems; 2, everything that we're doing around using more renewable energy and reducing greenhouse gas emissions; and 3, everything we're doing around new product innovation. Those are sort of my 3 headlines. But under forest, there's obviously a lot of work we do there, and I think that's where I talked about 5 individual areas of activity under the forest ecosystem category.
Great, thank you for the clarification.
Sorry for that confusion.
No, I think it was great that you had so many good options for pictures. So I think that's always helpful. Thinking about actually that second area in particular, obviously there's a lot of overlap in greenhouse gas mitigation and the resilience planning. And you had noted a lot of, I think, the kind of economic benefits of doing that. Can you talk a little bit about some of the, I guess, resilience benefits of the greenhouse gas mitigation? Not just the fact that you may be more efficient, but that you may actually be maintaining, through the use of more biomass and the reduction of waste, perhaps having more on-site power generation. You may actually be protecting yourself and your operations against extreme weather and climate. I was wondering if you could talk about what some of those other benefits might be, in addition to, I think, what would normally be the greenhouse gas accounting or the efficiency ones.
Right. Well, in that resilience, that area, I was trying to focus on the fact that, I guess maybe at an even higher level, the forest ecosystem section was really looking at how do we protect that fundamental asset. So really and what do we learn in terms of adapting practices to ensure that asset continues to function the way it needs to function. In the second one, I guess I was really thinking about it in terms of, economic resilience, but being one, energy self-sufficient is both has an operational resilience to it as well as an economic resilience to it. So where you have events that may take down power systems, the fact that we are generating a lot of our own power needs on site it has that additional benefit of not just being sort of better economics, but it also has it gives you more operational flexibility, and you're not dependent as dependent on the grid. Now, one of the things that we are starting now to get into, which I didn't really talk about, which is I would also probably put in the area of an economic opportunity for us, but it's a societal resilience issue, is starting to work with some of our power providers and trying to sell back to the grid some of the renewable energy that we're generating if we can generate excess power compared to what our ongoing needs are. It's certainly in our pulp and paper line of business. That's where we have the greatest opportunities to be able to do that. And the economic resilience, again, in times right now, people might be we're a little complacent, I guess. Natural gas is cheap, but we have gone through cycles where we've seen natural gas prices get really out of control. We're a commodity-based business, and what we need to do in terms of our kind of insured operations is keep our cost margins as low as possible. So having access to more lower cost fiber or lower cost fuel is very helpful from that standpoint. From a wood basket resilience standpoint, I'll make the point that you may be getting at that I did not mention, which is as we are able to utilize more biomass, while we certainly have a large timberland base, and oftentimes that timberland base is in fact supplying our manufacturing operations, but not to 100%. And in some parts of some places where we have manufacturing facilities, we might not have very much timberlands at all to supply a particular mill. So we're out there having to purchase materials from private forest landowners, for the most part, who may be commercial growers of forests, but they may be farmers or they may be private landowners that just kind of manage less intensely, manage their forest lands less intensely. If by adding an additional value to biomass that 20 years ago, where people were, most of the pulp mills were reliant on diesel and other cheap fossil fuels to power the mills, there really wasn't much use for that kind of leftover, the chip that's left over after you've made your 2x4 and then you put your nice clean chip from the outer core into a pulp product. It's all the other stuff is what goes into biomass. So it's what we call the residuals from the mill. So that might be bark and odds and ends in the mill, as well as sometimes harvest residuals that come in with the log, and that might be limbs and tops of trees. When you can provide a greater value stream for that product, you provide more of an economic incentive for people to grow forests. And that's a really important point, because most of the forest land in the United States, for example, is privately held. And the reason it's privately held is because people get an economic value from it. So it's an important cycle to think through. Getting all of that, a greater amount of economic value, is a real incentive to people to keep their land in timberland, and that's ultimately a wood basket resilient issue on a regional basis. So
thank you. We got another question about, and I'm going to kind of ask this two ways. What federal and state level policies do you guys found to be effective for promoting climate-friendly products and innovation? And kind of the converse, are there federal or state level policies that have been barriers or have served as disincentives for either pursuing new products or for pursuing resilience in general?
It's a complicated question because I could probably talk too long about. So I'll try to sum it up. We would support federal and state policies. Let's just take the topic we were talking about, which is biomass used in power. There are policies that acknowledge biomass as a renewable energy resource. There are some policies that don't acknowledge it. And that's one that we have found to be, it's a barrier. If we have examples where people, there's sort of, I think, a lot of times when people think of renewable energy, they want to focus the policies on new sources of energy, and that's all great. I mean, we're engaged in doing that on wind and geothermal, but we also believe you should not negate sources of fuels, and I'm thinking specifically of a category we would call spent pulping liquor, and that's a lot of the residuals we use in our mills in order to generate power. We've had some states that don't allow that to be recognized as a renewable energy source, and we've been able to overturn that in a few areas because based on the actual arguments, it is coming from a renewable resource and should be allowed, and we've been successful with that. So I think, and we've currently, we have challenged EPA in their regulation under PSCs on whether or not biomass combustion should be treated differently from fossil fuel, and we would really take the position that yes, it should be. We've been working with them on a way to do that, but that we think it would be really a mistake for any kind of barriers to be put up that would prevent that. In some cases, we've had, sometimes barriers turn into motivations for innovation, and some of the energy codes that have put requirements in from an energy standpoint for insulation. A few years ago, there was a change that caused us. We initially looked at it as a barrier, and then we started that helped us lead to the product innovation that I talked about of providing both insulation as a part of one of our strengths, like a weight-bearing product that is used for constructing walls in a home. And so we would want to make sure that that there's people are looking at good science and in setting out things, energy codes, and making sure those systems don't prevent the use of a wood product or not recognize the benefits of a wood product. We would find barriers to programs that don't acknowledge, I think, that the larger life cycle benefits of a wood product, because it is ultimately coming out of that renewable forest resource, which is really critical, I think, to the whole country's climate profile.
Great. I think that perspective about the kind of ways that policies or regulations can cut both ways is really interesting, both as a barrier and as a potential motivating factor. One final question is just from your perspective, what is it that you need that you may not have right now? Is there something in kind of the availability of decision-making tools, perhaps related, or something perhaps related to this policy question that we just asked? Something about data, something about the partnerships that you could get, that you've been having that you could have at a greater scale or reoriented towards another goal? Is there one, two, or three things that you really think are the most important in your kind of continued activities?
That's a really good question. I keep finding the answer coming back to what we really do need is more science. And I'm thinking we have an effort that we've been working with the Department of Agriculture on the Department of Agriculture has a label for biologically based products, and we would like to use that label, but somehow in between that legislation that was passed a while ago, about 20 years ago, and regulations, it prohibited any product that was manufactured prior to 1972, I think, or some date like that. It prohibited it from being labeled as a biologically based product. So that's a really simple one, because when we go and talk to members of Congress and say we would really like to see this changed, and they go, well, a tree seems pretty biologically based, and that would seem like a logical thing for you to be able to use, and yet we've been probably working on this particular issue for a year and a half, just so we can help add to the recognition that wood is this renewable resource. I guess my answer why I come up with science is it would be really nice if science was ruling that decision rather than some sort of policy choice where, just because a 2x4 has been invented some years ago doesn't mean it's a it isn't biologically based, or doesn't mean it's not a product that you want to continue to promote in some way, particularly as a building material. That's just one example of where you look at it, you kind of scratch your head and you go, well, why do we have to even fight that particular fight? It should be pretty obvious. Using wood is using a biologically based product. So I think making sure policy is based on sound science maybe is the summary statement that I think we do need more of. As we go into a world where climate events are changing, I think it is very important that we look at what is really happening, and we learn what's happening rather than make assumptions about what we think is happening. And science is really important for that.
Well, great. Thank you, Sarah, for that concluding thought. As a scientist, I definitely concur, and I'm glad that we can end on that note. I want to thank you again for a great presentation and excellent answers to these questions. I want to thank the audience for sticking with us. This was, I think, a great webinar, and we hope that you'll come back to our upcoming webinars. We have 3 more in this series. We'll have a presentation October 30th from the Hartford, November 13th from American Water, and December 4th from Rio Tinto. They all were part of our case studies for our business resilience report. This link on this last page, last slide, shows the where you can go to register. And please, if you haven't checked out the report, feel free to do that. And we hope to see you back here in a couple weeks. So thank you very much, everybody, and take care.